Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome back to the Princeton AI Alignment and Safety Seminar, or Passing Shot. PASS is a virtual and collaborative space for diverse researchers to learn and discuss how to align increasingly capable AI models for safe behavior. I'm Yang Sipo, and I will be hosting today's session with Sadika and Professor Sanjeev Arora. The seminar will be 1 hour long and live streamed on YouTube. During the session, you are welcome to post your questions or comments on the YouTube chat. You are also welcome to join our mailing list and follow us on Twitter to get notified of speakers and live stream links. You can find the links in the live stream chat. Today, we're excited to have Dan Hendrycks joining us. Dan is a founder and executive director of the Center for AI Safety. He received his PhD in AI from UC Berkeley. He has contributed the GILU activation function, MMLU dataset, and an introduction to AI safety, ethics, and society. Today, he will be talking about an overview of catastrophic AI risks. Without further ado, let's welcome Dan.
Hey, great. Thank you for having me. So let's see if this works. Fantastic. So I'm using the slides from the book, An Introduction to AI, Safety, Ethics, and Society. And in it, I'm going to, this is basically the first set of slides in the course, and this is where I'm giving an overview of all these sorts of risks. So let's talk about the different risk sources. I'm trying to deal with AI risks at a holistic level. I'm not just talking about the risks of misalignment. I'm trying to talk about what are all the things that increase risk, whether they're technical in nature or whether they are social in nature. So if we try and break these risks down, we could possibly put them into 4 buckets. One bucket is the risk of malicious use or intentional risks. There's these AI racing dynamics is another type of risk, and that's structural sorts of risks. And then there are organizational risks, which are risks of accidents or accidental risks. And then there's internal or intrinsic risks, which are those of rogue AI or loss of control. So malicious use, racing dynamics, organizational risks, and rogue AIs are the 4 areas that we will zoom into a bit today. First, we'll start with malicious use. So for some context, there's the White House executive order. This sort of frames the some of the main types of malicious use that we might care about, which are the use of AI systems to create chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, or CBRN weapons, and cyber attacks. There are other types of things you could care about too, such as deception, obfuscation, but I'll save that for loss of control section. And there are other types of malicious use as well, but these are some of the salient ones in DC right now because they affect national security. So if we zoom in, what's these? What are the risks from bioweapons? Well, we know that bioweapons can be bad. I mean, the Black Death killed almost half the population in the West, and could easily imagine human engineered pandemics being significantly worse than what nature throws at us. One is a much more stochastic process that's not optimized for lethality. You could imagine that AIs could be used in a dual-use way, which would make the risks of pandemics substantially worse. So while they get better at biology, which would help improve healthcare, they also become more dangerous for bioweapons. Likewise for cyber, they get better at programming, but then they could also be used for hacking. AIs that are more empathetic or understand people better could be more empathetic, but they could also be used for manipulation. So a lot of the benefits are tied up in the risks with AI. There's a risk of non-experts using things like large language models, and there's also these other biological design tools. The large language models have to help democratize many sorts of risks, where the threat of bioweapons is something like the number of people with skill and access to build a bioweapon multiplied by their interest in doing so, or propensity to create a bioweapon. And with large language model in the future, I'm not talking about current large language models, but when they get smarter, you could imagine that if everybody has access to it and it's easy to jailbreak, then the number of people with the skills would increase by multiple orders of magnitude. Because it's not just a few hundred top virology PhDs, it's basically anyone. So your risk surface really blows up. Not talking about current large language models. Probably most of the risk is also not just, I imagine much of it will actually flow through multimodal models where you can take a picture of, your Petri dish in the lab and all these sorts of things. And you can ask the questions, what should I do next? That is a way in which the risk surface gets increased substantially. And there's one example of how easy it is to repurpose these systems for bad, even if they're good or designed for good things, is you can, in drug discovery, there's a penalty in some drug discovery AI systems. There's a penalty for toxicity. If you flip the sign on toxicity, then you give it a few hours and it can quickly rediscover some famous chemical weapons, as well as create new ones, or as well as discover good formulas for new ones. Moving on to cyber risks. Basically, cyber risks, or the risk of cyber weapons, becomes substantially more catastrophic when it's applied toward critical infrastructure. So while AI systems can help democratize cyber offense and defensive technologies, the offense becomes a bit more concerning, not because in theory you couldn't patch, but because in practice things are not patched quickly. So if you have AI systems that can hack arbitrary things, and any script kiddie can launch a sophisticated cyber attack, unfortunately, much of our critical infrastructure, in particular things like power grids, don't receive patches the next day. It doesn't update every week like Google Chrome. It's not like that. They haven't been updated in years, and people have to manually do that, and it can be quite costly. Such that it doesn't happen very frequently. Why hasn't it happened yet? If our critical infrastructure, many parts of it are sitting ducks, because there aren't pecuniary incentives to do so. Attacking critical infrastructure on the U.S. would constitute an act of war. Not many people, not many adversaries that are capable enough of attacking critical infrastructure are interested in going to war with the United States. But if this is something highly accessible, such that random people can do it, then you're exposed to a substantially higher risk of catastrophes. The way to fix this is not as much. It helps to have better AI tools, AI cyber defense type of tools, but this seems largely a political problem of there being a sort of, maybe sell it as a moonshot effort for hardening our critical infrastructure. So it's a if our critical infrastructure is attacked, if our critical infrastructure goes down, there's some complicated, maybe intuitive reasons why this would create quite a window for a great power conflict. That's sort of like the prime time to attack, and you have a lot more deniability as to who did the attacks and things like that. There's also a risk later, which is when we have AI agents, people just simply instructing AIs to cause a lot of damage. Of course, there's use Chaos GPT from a while ago. It's not any good. It's just a demo. But in the future, you can imagine people specifically unleashing AI systems to wreak havoc. And they may go through some of the routes we already discussed, such as attack critical infrastructure if they're trying to cause a lot of damage, or build a bioweapon. It gives a lot of leverage. But the solution for the biodefense is largely we need more time to get like good nucleic acid monitoring across the world. It's still just like we just need like at least another year for that to be scaled up. In the case of cyber defense, I think it's largely a political effort and top-down governmental effort, and having the owners of critical infrastructure actually update it or make it more have the update speed improve substantially. And for this here, you would actually have, as Jan LeCun would mention, for rogue AIs, you would actually have AI systems counteracting bad AI systems. That's actually a thing you'd want. You'd want AI watchdogs and things like that to monitor the situation. In the sort of less wrongy AI risk sort of landscape, they would absolutely hate the suggestion, but they're wrong. This will be an important part of the future of having AI watchdogs. That'll be important. Why might people want to do this? Let's just remember that, like, I shouldn't use the phrase sociopathic or psychopathic. Antisocial personality disorder is like not the most uncommon thing. They're also very resentful people generally in the world. Other people may say that, AI should succeed us. Or that, although it's an expert level AI virologist or a super great hacking tool that could destroy critical infrastructure, open source is the only way. So there might be ideological people, accelerationists, or open source type of people who are following their ideology off of the end of a cliff. So those are some risk sources of people internally proliferating these risks or putting these risks out there for some random rogue actors to make use of. Now, I mentioned a lot of these risks are from random people misusing AIs in bad ways. There's another way things can be misused, which would be basically using these to have a surveillance state or an unshakable totalitarian regime where it can monitor everything that you're doing. This is also another sort of risk, another misuse risk. So it's not just we need to there's power that needs to be taken out of the hands of the little guy or something. There's a risk of too much concentration of power as well, and that creates other sorts of potential catastrophes. So for this, it will be a dialogue. It will need to be a dialogue about the correct balance between the concentration and dispersal of power, and we'll need to decide on a regime for how to proliferate this technology. Will the most powerful AI systems be developed in a democratically controlled institution? What are the mechanisms in that institution? These are problems we will have to confront. But it's not as simple as lock up all the models and give them to the military. And it's not as simple as open sourcing. I think there's some balance that we'll need to strike. Some ways of reducing malicious use would be structured access. So just as if you're wanting to do experiments on Ebola, you need approval to work in a BSL-4 facility. Well, I mean, for some types of Ebola, if you're wanting to work with Ebola, you need to have things like access to a BSL-4 facility. And likewise, if you're wanting to work with expert level AI virology tools, you should need some approval for that, is basically what I'm suggesting. That's structured access. There are other things like legal liability, so that they don't just say, oh, well, we open sourced it, or oh, somebody malicious jailbroke our model, but they are the ones who told it to cause the damage. We're not responsible. That's not a good idea. I think the AI, because the externalities cannot be internalized by the terrorist. If you're going to say, we're going to find the terrorist for their terrorist, I don't think the terrorist particularly cares. They're already going to jail if they've killed if they've killed lots of people, saying and they're also gonna we'll fine them $5 billion. This isn't gonna help. What are they going to do? So we need to focus on prevention, and we need to have AI developers internalize some of those externalities. And in fact, we have legislation. The Center for AI Safety as Action Fund has co-sponsored legislation in the California State Senate exactly on this purpose, which is liability for catastrophic harms, which is that if they cause $500 million of damage or more in a single event, or if they if somebody maliciously uses their system to cause a large-scale loss of life, the AI developers may be found liable. Advances in defensive technology, such as metagenomic sequencing, if those costs go down, if we do that across the world, we can have earlier detection of if somebody is releasing a bioweapon, and other forms of anomaly detections, such as AI watchdogs and whatnot, will be important as well. As we can see that in this AI risk thing, there isn't silver bullet. This isn't just quote unquote solve alignment or something like that. There's a lot of things you have to do, some technical, some political, for mitigating AI risk in a holistic manner. So although this is an AI subject, it doesn't make sense just for AI people to be trying to address these risks at all. Sort of like climate change. You don't have just climate scientists reduce the risks, or you don't have physicists reduce the risks of nuclear weapons. So right now, we kind of, how the discourse is, there's kind of assuming that AI scientists are going to do something about it. And I think this needs to be, I think that's reflective of how people are not thinking holistically about these sorts of risks. So let's talk about racing dynamics, the second risk source. Here we have risks from competition to develop increasingly powerful AI systems between militaries and corporations and individuals. So, if we have military arms race, that'll have very intense competitive pressures. The AI systems will be made substantially more lethal, even if they're not the most reliable. Still probably keep going down that route, especially if there's a risk that some other adversary is going to do it. So I think this is very much a classic collective action problem we find ourselves in. Just as with nuclear weapons, other countries don't want nuclear weapons. We don't want nuclear weapons to exist, but we would prefer for ourselves to have it. And so while we don't find this general path endorsable, we'll end up condoning it regardless. And I think a similar thing is happening in AI development at multiple levels of organization, at the military level, or at the international level, as well as inside of the nation, among corporations in the economy, where there's high risks. Sam Altman 10% for AI risk, Dario 20%, Elon 10 to 20% probability of AI existential risk. Regardless, they're continuing forward because, well, if we don't, someone else will. So, and we need to stay competitive to maintain our influence. This pushes actors to do things they would not generically endorse. Automated warfare is more hazardous. I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense, but I'm saying it's substantially more hazardous. And giving a lot of power to unreliable AI systems, I find quite concerning, and I think is an on-ramp to other types of existential catastrophes. And if it leads to a great power conflict, that'll probably be the greatest catastrophe humanity has seen so far. AIs also distinctly facilitate this. Although it's another thing like gunpowder and nuclear weapons and now AI, it also effects. If you look at, the sort of models of conflict, there's more uncertainty in this AI space of what are the capabilities of the adversary. It's uncertain as to how capable my adversary will be, because when they train their next model, did they have some algorithmic development that made it substantially more capable than my own? The sort of landscape of what capabilities will look like with the next model is always very unclear, and that will continue to be the case. And whether they leapfrog you or subtly gain some surprising advantage from, changing their pre-training recipe or something like that is a substantial concern. It also does other things like reduces the cost of war, as well as these competitive pressures encourage humans to be out of the loop, because humans basically become more and more of a liability. They aren't good for when the pace of war increases to such an amount. Right now, here's what it is for AI integrated command and control centers. Basically, there's a quote unquote staccato of approve. Like that's sort of what we are at now. Humans going to get more and more redundant for that. And the next will just be doing, pressing the button, yes. And just because humans in the loop, I don't actually think a human is in the loop in those types of situations. That creates, if there's some, accident or something like that, this could easily escalate very quickly, faster than we know about it. There's also the corporate AI race, which basically results in us ceding over more power to AI systems eventually, and more control and decision making, because what it is now is AIs are writing our emails, then they're doing tasks for us, making our PowerPoints, and completing various little projects for us. At some point, they take entire jobs, and maybe you get AI CEOs in the future. I mean, if they're more competitive, might be perfectly sensible to do so. And the companies that resist this trend are like those that resisted the cotton gin. They get outcompeted and lose relevance. So if you don't align with this force, if you don't align with competitive pressures, you're done. So the larger AI development process is more aligned with competitive pressures and selective forces, and what is most fit in this competitive ecosystem, as opposed to it being aligned with human values and what will be most beneficial. I think that, by the way, this sort of structural AI racing dynamics and these competitive pressures is actually the largest risk source. It drives most of what's going on in AI. And a lot of the technical AI researchers are fairly unresponsive to this fact, and think that what we need to do is we need to improve the interpretability of AI systems, and then we're going to be okay. Does absolutely nothing to address this sort of issue. I guess this is an exemplification of how we have a very interesting AI race going on. It's a classic collective action problem. We'd all like to proceed at a somewhat slower, more cautious rate, or many of us would, including leaders of these organizations, but it's just not an option. We can, so by default, but in the longer term, this looks like people continuing to displace more and more people, and AI is gaining more and more influence. No one is to blame in that process. It's a collective action problem. So a way that we lose control and hand over decision-making in powered AI systems is actually not AI is confiscating it from us and seizing it from us. It's not necessary. By default, that basically happens. And if it happens extremely quickly, may at best have nominal control, or we may just have some illusion of control, or we may create an ecosystem that sort of slips from our influence. It's also the case that these competitive pressures also increase probability of accidents and various disasters, and cutting corners on safety. There are several notable examples throughout history. So this systemic condition is what exposes us, or predicts a lot of the extent to which we would face some types of disaster. This is one that we basically have to fix or have to reduce substantially. since I think it enables most of the other risks. It increases our risk tolerance substantially. I mean, I mentioned Sam, Dario, and I have Anthropic and Elon, are in the 10 to 30% range each. That's the risk tolerance. They're like, yep, even if 30% chance of human extinction, still going to go ahead with this. So risk tolerance is quite high. I think in other things, like if this were a government project, I don't think the risk tolerance would be nearly as high. Maybe it would be at most like 10%. If it were some international project with a lot of, I think it may be like 3% or something. Ways of reducing racing dynamics, there could be transparency over these orgs, there's safety regulation, a lot of oversight, international coordination to some extent, international coordination and treaties, something like an AIEA equivalent for compute monitoring. Could be in order that would reduce racing dynamics, because then at least the capabilities of all the different players in this space, and making sure that there's no if you wanted to impose a global moratorium, for instance, you could actually do that if you're keeping track of your compute. But without that, you can't create a pause. You can't halt this process for 5 years, say, in the face of competitive pressures without some very strong trust mechanisms. So you need to build in these trust mechanisms, and that requires international institutions and coordination mechanisms, such as on-device mechanisms to do things like a remote shutdown. If like this GPU is not registered to approved place, this highly advanced AI trained GPU, it cannot be powered on as a consequence. So like if this GPU is being sold on the black market, it's useless. Right now we have export controls, they wind up on the black market. This isn't enough just to have export controls. You're going to probably need something like on-chip mechanisms. I also think other things like more democratic control over the development of these AI systems is very much in order. Seems like crazier now, but I don't see how, I don't see why random tech people should be, have such influence over the development of humanity. I think the public hasn't woken up to how significant this technology is yet, but when they do, I think that'll be a reasonable ask. And we'll go a bit more quickly over the remaining two, since the first two are quite visceral and salient. This third one is these accident risks inside these organizations. Basically, even if you don't have competitive pressures, you still have things like space shuttles exploding, or nuclear power plants melting down. So it's not all competitive pressures. Even if you have a government project, this matters. So the organizational safety matters too. The safety culture of an organization is important. I think the intrinsic accident level of AIs actually seems to be higher than some of these more well understood technologies, such as, say, nuclear reactors, for which you can have more theoretical guarantees, and you have a strong, principled, fundamental, clean understanding of many of the constituent parts. That is not the case with AI systems. You have instead basically an engineering science, which is very bottom up and evolutionary, and I can claim, for instance, like I suppose in the introduction you mentioned that I made the Jello activation function. I don't know why it works. I had some intuitions that guided me to make it. I don't know why it works, and that was like in 2016. I don't think anybody knows why most of this stuff works in deep learning, and I think that will continue to be the case. We could get some catastrophes if you have some gain of function research. So some of these evals things could become potentially quite dangerous later. Some of as organizations doing gain of function. You could also have bugs, just generically, like, oops, we flipped the sign, this has happened. and like it gets deployed with some sign flip, or like, oh, GPT's messing up for the next few hours or something, and start spouting nonsense. That happened for like 6 hours. Or I suppose there are more notable examples of this though. There's Gemini, there's Microsoft Tay, there's Microsoft Sydney. Like this is actually kind of common, unfortunately. There might also be other things like the unintentional release. Oops, we accidentally leaked this. Another big intellectual error, I think probably the largest intellectual error, is accidentally confusing safety research with capabilities research. So I think it'll be important for there to be work on clarifying what the difference between the two is. I'll have some upcoming paper, hopefully by Hendrycks, which just sort of measures the correlation of, here's a data set, how correlated is this with general capabilities? And if the correlation is really high, then that's probably not actually a safety data set. And as we find that like over half of the purportedly safety data sets have like 85% plus correlations with general capabilities, such that like I don't think that they're measured. There are some that are lower and actually measure something distinct. The other ones are basically measuring the same phenomena as other types of capabilities data sets, despite having a different theme to them. That's another probably the most systematic error going on in industry right now, is the conflation between, they'll just have a capabilities advance and say, this will help make them do what you want more. And so since the AIs are doing what you want more, they're writing better code, they're more aligned, this type of thing is fairly common. There's a lot of business alignment. They're being aligned with business goals currently, and they're calling that safety. I'll skip over that. A high-level intuition of improving safety in general and safety engineering is things like the Swiss cheese model. This is not a full view of what goes on in organizational safety and safety engineering. If you want to learn more about safety engineering, you can go to aisafetybook.com, and I have a chapter on safety engineering, so that you can be aware of that literature and its relation and as applied to AI. But one intuition, which was fought against by the less wrongers for a very long time, is the Swiss cheese model, where you have multiple layers of defenses compensating for each other's weaknesses. So you don't just stake everything on some particular alignment solution. You need multiple lines of defense to increase your nines of reliability, and you drive down risks. The reason they fought against this was because they're like, either a perfect solution or nothing, perfect or bust, and this just was not the intuition. This was not how safety engineering is done anywhere. Yeah. So anyway, this is, fortunately now I think this is no longer a contentious point, but this is, get me heckled back in the day. So there's a lot of things to do to improve organizational safety and improve safety culture and reduce risks of accidents. Red teaming, affirmative demonstrations of safety before releasing, various deployment procedures and processes for high stakes decisions, response plans, internal auditing and risk management, external auditing, incorporating safe design principles like defense in depth throughout the organization, et cetera, et cetera. These reducing probability of things leaking. There's a lot of stuff to do here. That said, I think of these risk sources, this is not as big of a deal as I think malicious use risks and racing dynamics. Interestingly, the political focus in this past year has been on the organizational safety. I think that's that's better than nothing, but I think priorities wise, I think things like international coordination, I think and like what our militaries are going to do and whether these AI companies are racing in the first place matters quite a bit more than are they going to spend did the red teaming go on for 2 months instead of 1.5 months or something like that. I don't know if this will make that much of a difference. And then finally, rogue AIs. So rogue AIs is a very checkered history. Most of the mechanisms that be purported for rogue AIs emerging just didn't really didn't end up seeming that particularly plausible. Things like instrumental convergence, rests on tautologies and things that, like, including myself, took for granted as being rock solid arguments, but are not. But so, like, what are, and there are a lot of speculative mechanisms being invoked that are very much in search of what is a way to argue that there could be a sort of rogue AI as opposed to the conclusion being organically arrived at. That said, I do think there are some rogue AI risks. In particular, there. Oh, well, I got a bit ahead of myself, but here's an example of an AI that's not controlled as intended. And this is from a major corporation making a big deal about their new product and whatnot, and these sorts of things are troubling signs. But the main way in which I could see a loss of control or an AI having some goals very different from our own. I mean, we're doing a reasonable job right now. Like, AIs are sort of like doing what we're requesting. We're going to have AI agents that are doing what we're requesting. We have papers. We had a paper at ICML last year on, like, your agents. Yes, they have some disposition toward doing instrumentally useful things to accomplish their goals and whatnot, but, like, you can offset it in various ways, or you can apply losses to it, and we can also instruct them to do what we want. But with automated AI R&D, it's a little interesting. When you get, let's say it's some years in the future, when you get AI that can automate, AI research, it's a world-class AI researcher. How far is this away? It's unclear. IMO gold medal is plausibly, 2025 type of capability. Maybe this is a 2026 capability. The AI R&D, if you have a lot of these AIs doing that research, let's say you get, like, if you get one of them, then you can make 10,000 copies or 100,000 copies. And you have them doing research. You wait a year, and in that year, maybe they do a decade's worth of progress. So you have really rapid AI development. So this would be like an intelligence explosion. It's not an over the night one. It's not like the AI goes from, like, IQ like 130 to, like, a gazillion overnight. That's what people think when they think of intelligence explosion. Instead, it's artificial AI research community does a lot of research, and in a year's time, they have many years worth of progress or development. And what AI system do they create or comes outside the other end is something vastly more intelligent and unclear whether that thing that comes out of that very fast moving process that we didn't have that much oversight over because it happened so quickly. Unclear if that would be whether the AI would do our bidding. That's it could be even faster than that, of many decades in a few months. It's unclear exactly. But anyway, this is a mechanism that's very difficult to reason about, and I think is most concerning. Maybe it's the case that automated AI researchers actually wouldn't substantially increase the rate of algorithmic development. Maybe they wouldn't find that many things. Maybe it would depend very much more strongly just on simple scaling. So it's unclear, but this is a mechanism for rogue AIs. And another thing in rogue AIs, I think that this goes by many names. It always gets rebranded every few years for mimetic reasons, or for idiosyncratic cultural reasons. But there's treacherous turn is what it's called, which is like when the AI, before it's deployed, or before, it's not even before deployed. I need to fix this slide. When the AI is not as powerful, it's acting one way, and then when some situation changes, then it decides to act some other way. So, like, it's pretending, like, an ex machina, like, oh, I love you, and then, like, oh, it traps him at the end of the movie. It's like that. And like this has always been difficult to rule out because it's partly a God of the gaps type of thing where it's like, is the AI going to turn on you? Well, there's this one thing we don't know as much about, so maybe the treacherous turn is hiding inside of there. But I think basically the way to reduce this risk is just have there be fewer and fewer places for these schemes to hide. I'm fairly optimistic about us just like having the risk be at like a level such that it's not like worth losing that much sleep over, because I think our ability to control whether AI is lie or not. I mean, you can see our representation engineering paper, for instance, where we can control whether the AI is lie or not. Now, there's a question of reliability, which needs to be improved. You want like 3 nines, 99.9% reliability. You don't want like, 90% reliability for your lie detectors and your ability to control whether they're honest. But I think we have traction on the problem. So the main problem that we don't have traction on is this intelligence explosion or automated research processes things and how to reason about that. But this probably is not a completely technical thing. I mean, it's a technical and it's a social thing. It's a socio-technical problem. How would you improve well, that's the thing. How would you improve the intelligence explosion stuff and like risks of rogue AIs? I mean, here's some stuff generally, but specifically on the intelligence explosion stuff, you probably want a metric for what's the intelligence level of the model. What's the, even if it's superhuman, how intelligent is the superhuman thing that's in front of me? Working on a metric like that, it'll be like, MLU2 or something. Maybe one of the final benchmarks or something. You want like good AI systems that can forecast, like what do, some impartial AI advisors who are watching the situation more closely, what are they predicting will happen next? Or are they predicting that, some bad outcome will happen? You'll want processes like on learning, making the AIs that are doing this research, like not have high quote unquote situational awareness. So you want to do some unlearning on them as well. If you want to learn about unlearning, you can go to wmdp.ai, where we had a recent paper on unlearning for expunging knowledge about CBRN weapons and cyber weapons. But overall, there are these 4 areas. I'll tie it together in the next few minutes just as a little exercise. But there are organizational risks. Organizations developing AIs could cause catastrophes if they prioritize profits over safety. And there's also these risks of rogue AIs. Before I spoke about malicious use and racing dynamics. But I'm gonna just as a fun exercise. These numbers aren't going to be taken seriously. This is done in like an afternoon. But it's like, imagine that we had really short timelines. Like we had like a human level AI in like a year or 2. Then what does the world look like the year after, and what are our risks? Well, I don't know. These are completely made up numbers. Like maybe it's an international project. It's like, multiple countries come together. This is like a year after you get human level AI, and like development is proceeding at this lab at this international project because we've coordinated more. Or maybe it's the US military says, no, we're in control. Or maybe it's something like Western companies are just continuing to lead the way and compete with. So it's like OpenAI versus XAI versus Meta versus Google. Or it's like China, but on very short timelines, China is just much less likely. So it was basically initially it was a 3rd way split, and well, there's still China, so we'll give a little mass to them. So I'll just subtract a small percent off. What are some failure modes? I think it's basically in the very short timelines for the absolute worst failure modes. Things like AIs getting rights and taking over steadily and us becoming second-class species. We're just talking about what are the risks we face a year out after this human level AI given short timelines. So I'm not considering these like, uncontrolled, evolution of the new AI species. I'm not talking about that as much. I'm talking about the things more in the short term. It's just an exercise. Like maybe there's like intelligence explosion leading to a loss of control over rogue AI, or intelligence explosion is controlled enough, and then they've got a really, really powerful AI system. something, a super intelligence basically. And this super intelligence lets them do a coup. So intelligence explosion means that like they got like 5 orders of magnitude of like algorithmic progress or something like that. So they just like have leapfrogged everyone. Does this let them do a coup? And then will they use that ability to do the coup to enshrine to cement an unshakable totalitarian regime? So we'll walk through like the first 2, and then we'll consider the third last. So intelligence explosion, would it happen? Wouldn't it? I don't know. Once you get human level AIs, would there be some crazy algorithmic improvements or not? I don't know. We'll just say like half chance. And then given that there's an intelligence explosion, what's probably a loss of control? I don't know, it'd be like 20%. What's the probability that there's the ability to coup the world, given that they've had a really powerful AI system, and that they use the coup to create an unshakable totalitarian regime? I don't know. We'll need to break that down a bit. If it's an international project, I think their coup potential is a bit less because there's a lot of eyes on them. They also aren't coupled with military force if it's an international project. And then the probability that they would want to try and take over the world with that is like, I think also relatively low. Meanwhile, if it's like Western companies, I think like probability that they'd be interested in, you know, these numbers are a bit made up. Maybe I could be convinced the China one would be much lower, for instance. Probability that Western companies would be interested in sort of, leader of this AI lab, I'm the only one responsible enough to, be the leader. I mean, I don't know why they're doing it in the first place, many of them, unless they're thinking they're distinctly like good compared to other people for shepherding humanity. But if it's a nation state that gets an intelligence explosion, probably they like can take over the world with its like quite a bit higher because it's coupled with like existing military defense systems and a nuclear arsenal and all these sorts of things. And then there's, if you multiply them through like, half chance times like these all together, those amount to some, probabilities here. And there's also these risks of bioweapons. Like if it's Western companies, I think like, there's just more risk of things leaking compared to in the other case. Then you end up with these sorts of probabilities. So like, there's a lot of risk. International project seems to look quite a bit better. But anyway, this is sort of overlaying like what are some scenarios, international project, US government project, Western companies, crossed with some of the main failure modes. What are the risk sources? So this suggests a few things of maybe these are the first principal components multiply, plot against the second principal component, so to speak, or something like that of our situation. But anyway, this is putting it together and seeing how they sort of like can, trade off against each other. So it's not all like, you can't, if somebody's just saying the reason why we need to do this is because they might build it and then they might use it to take over the world. It's like, well, what probability do you put on that? How does that square against these other sorts of risks and so on? It seems that most people started their AI companies sort of acting like, well, if I don't take over the world with the AI system, someone else will. They seem to be like all getting really obsessed about this particular probability, which is just part of that lost landscape. And I think is probably not a sufficient justification for many of them to have started some big AI project. But that's basically the probability they were invoking. Anyway, I guess with that, now we've got 12 minutes or so for questions, but hopefully this gave a holistic view. I'd suggest looking at AISafetyBook.com, where I'll have the lecture videos up fairly soon for that, but the text is already there, and so is the PDF and the slides. And that tries to get at a holistic view of this sort of AI risk situation. It's not just focusing on the technical stuff. If you want a technical course of topics, there's the I'm co-teaching a course at Berkeley on it. If you search like understanding LLMs at Berkeley, that's the course where you'll have the bookmark that site if you're wanting a topics course. We'll have the lecture videos up soon. It's just getting some person on the Berkeley side to share them with more of the Berkeley students. But yeah, there's so that's a technical research course for papers, and then for if you're interested in doing things more governance related, or just even having a broader sense of these risks more holistically, then the textbook can be suitable for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. That was a really great talk. And I think also a really helpful overview for people to understand how all these different kind of situations that we hear about fit together into like an overall taxonomy. I think our first question, our first topic is kind of about evaluations. So the Center for AI Safety has the Safe Bench competition for safety evaluation benchmarks. And in general, you have released a couple of different benchmarks that have been quite popular. So we wanted to know what you consider the primary considerations for constructing a good benchmark in this field are, and in particular, safety evaluations are kind of about showing an absence of a behavior. So how do you get people to buy into the soundness of your evaluation? And also a question from our audience member is like, in light of that, do you think it's really important to construct perfect data sets instead of having large, maybe slightly imperfect data sets?
Yeah, so I'm not focusing on evals in particular. I'm focusing on benchmarks. So the evals thing is sort of like, oh, nothing scary to see here, let's move on. I'm not looking for an indicator function. I'm looking for measurements that provide more than one bit of signal, because I don't think it's very useful if it's providing one bit. If it's providing many bits, then it can be used as a risk mitigation tool. So for instance, like WMDP, you can improve your learning methods with it, and that can reduce risks of malicious use, because you excise the hazardous knowledge from the models that are made available to everyone, and then just the only people with access to those models are the people who have a reason to have an expert level virology type of model. I talked about it, and we'll make sure that the link is added to the Safe Bench site. If you go to like safe.ai/blog, one of the blogs at the top would be devising ML metrics, where I basically speak about various principles for devising ML metrics in the first place. But yeah, I'm not just wanting indicator functions. I think we want something continuous. I think risk assessment is not ambitious enough for safety measurements. I think you want something that can be useful for risk mitigation, but for that you're going to need many bits of signal, something much more continuous that people can chip away at and develop methods to reduce risk from. And then separately, I think it's also important to have the benchmark not be highly correlated with general capabilities. Like, you don't want to just be measuring another. So by default, the capabilities are highly correlated. Its performance on history correlates with its performance on mathematics, correlates with its performance on philosophy, performance on accounting, etc. So a lot of these safety benchmarks are actually just like another one of those topics. They're not actually like testing anything different. So I think a goal is to come up with things that have a low correlation with the other stuff that people call capabilities things. So you can give it a safety gloss. You can, be in the mid-wit curve of like, no, this is really safety because of all these complicated reasons. And like, no, it's not. It's actually, you're just measuring how smart the AI is. So I think it's important not just come up with benchmarks that measure how smart the AI is. Like for an agent, like you could say, well, it'd be very safety relevant if it would on the flight booking agent, using a credit card when it shouldn't, that's a safety issue. It's like, no, you're not. You're just measuring how generally capable the agents are. Now, that's not a hard requirement. There might be some types of capabilities that you particularly want to measure that are hazardous and difficult to pull off. But generally, I think it'd be good if one can try and focus on some dimensions other than how big is the model and having that predict most of the performance on the task. happily I can share more information about that. We have some upcoming like paper. We're just basically like taking all those, as I mentioned earlier, taking all the safety benchmarks and just like measuring their correlation. And some of them are very correlated, some of them are less. Like adversarial examples, some forms of adversarial examples, like the GCG attack adversarial suffixes, some paper or center and CMU put out last year. Those are not highly correlated. But some other types of adversarial attacks are, like there's contract, like there's ANLI type of adversarial examples from Meta some years ago. Those are very correlated. But yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So still regarding the future safety benchmarking, so how do you envision this process will be carried out? Because I think you mentioned in the talk, like try to assessing the risk required people of different backgrounds. And currently it seems like different companies, for example, OpenAI and Google, they have their own in-house evaluation pipelines. Do you believe that there will be some point in the future where all the companies agree on using a common benchmark, for example, something you built? Or alternatively, do you think there will be some point like there's a third party who can do all the safety evaluation in the future, and the company will just go with it? And if that do happen in the future, how do you think like the government will be involved? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I think that I wouldn't rely on a small group of researchers at a lab to come up with all of the benchmarks for safety mitigation, or for risk mitigation. For evaluations, like if you're just meaning like we're spot checking, sure, plenty of people can do spot checking, but like I think most of spot checking will be like the moment you have the new model, you'll poke at it and then you'll see whether it has the capabilities. Like I think that'll be the vast majority of where we'll find the new stuff, and you don't actually need to set up that much infrastructure for it. I mean, you want some infrastructure set up for it though, but like a lot of it will be revealed when you poke at the model after it's trained. But for risk mitigation, coming up with things for risk mitigation, that's a different story. That's measuring what is safety, what are things that the research community can productively work on to mitigate risks. And I think that's a much harder problem. I think that this won't be that straightforward, but for doing evaluations or doing some red teaming, external third parties doing that seems fairly plausible. Maybe it'll be like UK AI Safety Institute will like do that, but I don't think that will like let us know whether the AIs are safe or not, because like there are many things that we don't learn about the models until the research community has carried them to their conclusion. Like for instance, like I suppose it's Princeton, this SWE agent thing, is basically as good as Devin. And then, last night there's something that's even better than Devin. That's a mod of SWE agent. And this is like in the past like 2 weeks. And this is a year after GPT-4 was released to everyone. And after the research community has been shipping at it. So I don't think evaluations, I don't think you can design everything to fully test the capabilities of a model before the fact, given that a research community a year after the fact is still working through the implications of the technology. So yeah, I'm not just trying to do some evaluations in that sense for assessing, because I don't think it will catch everything. It's basically a Swiss cheese layer with a lot of holes. But I'd prefer these being metrics. Adversarial robustness is a metric. Trojans and backdoors is an important thing. Maybe there's some like controlling internal representation. Maybe there's some metric there. There's maybe unlearning metrics. These are the sorts of things I want benchmarked better. And there'll be more to do when agents come out too. I think there'll be a lot of benchmarks to create when agents are even more capable. So that's what I'm thinking for the things like safe bench, not just evaluations or spot checks.
Yeah, thanks. I think that makes a lot of sense. And also, I think a lot of the work that you've done has kind of advanced this view. Our last question, if you could briefly talk about this idea of an AI arms race and how the open sourcing of models interacts with like the speed that this race will go at, and what your views are on that. I'm just curious to hear about what you think should be the decision making around open sourcing a model, and how that fits into this arms race that you talked about.
Yeah, I think that the arms race later, I mean, Let's see. There's a lot of, and it's also commenting on a fairly longer time horizon. I imagine that we'll stop open sourcing fairly soon because it won't make economic sense to do so. So I think there's some natural pressures in that direction. I think as well, when they get sufficiently capable, it won't even be like legal if they like can be easily repurposed to be like a weapon of mass destruction. Like I don't see how that world is tenable. Right now, I think that some red line would be: do you have expert level AI virologist? If yes, or if it can be easily repurposed into being that, then that shouldn't be open sourced. If one of them did open source, I'm moving out of the city and I'm done, because it's you have a ticking time bomb in society. So that's like some example red line. I think right now the open sourcing cost benefits are actually unclear. I don't think it's robustly good. I don't think it's robustly bad. I think it's probably good, but it's not something I'd be particularly shooting for. Because it's at the level of like having these like AI technologies diffused throughout society, and it helps societal preparedness to some extent. I think society is like an organism; it needs some stressors, and I think that confronting spear phishing and all these sorts of things at like some like lower amount of level is some like good amount of stressors, but there are limits to stressors. I don't want to dump WMDs on society, or everybody gets their own WMD. That's not a stressor that society can cope with. But I think like right now it's probably a good thing, and I would even guess it'll be the case for like Llama 3. Llama 4, it's unclear. We'll have to see. We'll have to test it. We'll have to see how repurposable it is. We'll have to see if there are some types of safeguards that can be difficult to remove when it is open sourced. If that might be, maybe there's a benchmark, huh? How hard is it or easy is it to, maybe there's some metric that one can do there, and that could facilitate method development of, if you have full fine-tuning ability, how difficult is it to remove safeguards? That could be some interesting metric, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so with that, I think we're going to wrap up this session of the past seminar. Thank you again, Dan, for coming on. And please, everyone, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and keep an eye out on Twitter, and also keep checking our website for future talks. We have a couple more talks coming up this semester, and they're looking pretty exciting. So yeah, thank you again, Dan.
Have
Thank
a
you,
good
Dan.
day. Bye.